But again, thanks for making time for being here. My name is Gabriele Columbro. I'm the executive director of FINOS, the Fintech Open Source Foundation. I realized that financial services and open source is almost oxymoronic. But we want to change that perception, and that's really, in a nutshell, what FINOS is about. By the way, it is FINOS. Some people, they call it FINOS. Some people, they call it FinOS. We're not an operative system yet. Hopefully, at a certain point, we'll have enough components out there to be FinOS. So it's kind of my secret weapon. I'm keeping it there. So just a little bit of background on me. I actually do not come from financial services. I've only had 5 years now in my tenure in financial services. It's been a learning experience in good and bad ways. I actually come from the open source community, so I'm really excited to be for the first time here at All Things Open. I'm an Apache committer. I see Jim there, who led the way in Apache, and I'm just a committer, actually probably emeritus. I haven't been committing for a while. But certainly, I've spent many years both in community open source and commercial open source, working for a company called Alfresco, commercial open source content, enterprise content management. And a few years ago, I've had the luck to, and the honor to be called to run what at that time was called the Symphony Software Foundation. It's an open source foundation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept, focused on financial services, focused on not only solving specific challenges for the financial services industry, which I'm sure you would agree, if you're from the industry, that there's a lot of potential for collaboration, better collaboration across the firewall, but also that understands what does it mean to be a financial services open source foundation, while also understanding the challenges that, what it takes to collaborate across the firewall in a regulated industry. Certainly when I joined, I found very hard and very complicated the way these people work with each other, or didn't. But it is also understandable that they are very risk-averse enterprises. They work in a highly regulated context in which even talking to another company might generate, down the line, pretty big issues. And so the Symphony Software Foundation, now Fintech Open Source Foundation, is really focused on leveraging open source and open standards as a means to sort of solve these two issues. One, better collaboration on technology that is not necessarily differentiating for these companies, and B, helping them through the curve of maturity as to how you can do open source safely, whether it's consuming, contributing, or even being in a forum with 10 other regulated companies. Because over the years, open source has shown that it is a safe way of collaborating. And so by reusing all we learned in other communities, we're making them feel more and more comfortable. Now, I think what's unique in what we do is really the composition of our community. You can see a lot of pretty interesting logos as far as the financial services community goes. But we didn't want this to be a big boys club. This was supposed to be always an open forum, an open foundation. And so we're happy that over the years, we have grown representation from fintech companies. We've grown representation also from large tech, open source companies, Red Hat, GitHub, GitLab. Some of them are here. And so I think the element of cross-pollination that you see, I'm based in San Francisco, and most of the banks now want to call themselves technology companies, thinking that maybe sometimes creating an innovation lab and throwing some bean bags out there is going to make them innovative. Well, I do think that actually, as my experience from the community has taught me, bringing actual people together from different backgrounds really helps the cultural change that is needed for such a closed industry to do open source. We started a few years ago. I'm going to show you a little bit of a history. Again, this was sort of the breakdown of our community in terms of tech, fintech, and financial services companies. But just a quick note on our history. As I mentioned, we used to be called the Symphony Software Foundation. I got called to run the foundation had the honor to be called to run the foundation in 2015. Originally, the foundation was created around a software called Symfony, which is not the PHP framework. It's not I think there's other 2 or 3 symphonies out there for which we regularly used to get support inquiries. But it's a collaboration software that was put together as an investment by Goldman Sachs and several of those other investment banks that you've seen up there. And the original goal was to, in a way, challenge the lock-in that many of these firms had on Bloomberg, at least as far as the chat and collaboration platform went. And that's where I think it's important to realize that open source was a really functional part of that investment. All these banks joined up together to invest in this company, but that investment would not have happened if the code was not open source. None of these banks felt comfortable to invest in a highly secured, end-to-end encrypted company, communication company, where they would put their very important regulated information if it wasn't open source. And so that's, for me, it was really the first sort of beam of light in this industry as far as my experience has been. They called me and say, hey, banks want to do a cloud software, and they want to do it open source. It kind of blew my mind 5 years ago. If you fast forward a couple of years, we realized that the opportunity in the industry was much broader. This is an industry that has to collaborate by nature, at least in their daily business. They trade with each other, buy side, sell side. They exchange information. They exchange money. So there is no reason why, given that they all comply to the same regulations, they couldn't look at better standardization in the form of data, but actually better common implementation of this type of regulations. And so that's where we realized in late 2017 that there was a bigger opportunity, and we expanded into the Fintech Open Source Foundation. Our footprint is certainly in capital markets and investment banking. That's where we come from. But the charter and the name of the foundation was made broad enough because, again, the same sort of opportunities are there when it comes to retail, when it comes to payments, when it comes to ultimately everything that us as the average Joes have to interact with in terms of the financial services complex. And that's where mid last year we announced the Fintech Open Source Foundation. We've seen a really substantial growth in terms of members, in terms of contributions. Be happy to answer any question later on in terms of more specific projects that we do. But as far as today's presentation goes, there are 2 takeaways for me. The first one is time is actually ripe for open source in financial services. Again, it's not an easy challenge. I don't want to diminish the complexity of having highly regulated industries collaborate with each other. But hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll be able to show you why the drivers are aligned for all the players that partake to this ecosystem. And finally, as I said, this is not an easy challenge. We need help. We need help from individuals. Communities are certainly, modern open source communities. If you think about the Linux Foundation or even our foundation are certainly corporate funded. There's a lot of, corporate money that comes in through membership. But ultimately, communities are made of individuals. And, individuals like you that are already expert in how to collaborate in financial services and can become mentors in this community would mean, teaching by example, would mean, hopefully an opportunity for you as an individual, to access a market that, from a development standpoint has been largely closed over the years. And hopefully for your organization. If you're working for a consulting company, a company that sells tech in financial services, there's a huge opportunity for commercial open source. And hopefully I can pass the message by the end of this talk. Trying to fix my microphone here. So I want to start with a little bit of a parallel here, because I think it's important to put in context of how quickly this might happen, or slowly, you judge. But when I think about, I started my career in open source about 15 years ago, actually in government and open source. I was, as you can hear, I'm clearly from that Italian part of the Silicon Valley. But I was working in Italy, definitely not the most sort of tech advanced, or open, innovative country at that time. I moved to Holland for a project for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as I moved to Holland, this was 2007, actually the Queen was talking about open source. The Queen, like a 75, 80 years old person, was talking about, public tenders should only be assigned to open source companies unless, meaning it's kind of an opt-out model. Like you either, choose an open source vendor, or you got to explain me why you're, letting go of this lock-in reduction type opportunity. And that was pretty amazing to me. Again, coming from a country where it's been really hard to do business and definitely innovate in terms of technology, it was amazing. Now, that was 2007, but if you fast forward, 10 years, we're now living in a world where the American government has a fully sort of is big proponent and has an open sort of repository of all their code in code.gov, fostering reuse. The European Union has a union-wide open source strategy. And I mean, this is just 10 years. I mean, in terms of government time, this is not too much. And so again, there are many similarities between government and financial services in terms of how regulated they are, and in terms of even sort of culturally, they're not, in 2007, nobody would look at the government as a tech organization. And so what I see here is an industry that is going very much through the same process of innovation, and I think that open source can play a key role. So hopefully we can take less than 10 years. My gut feeling is that 10 years is probably about right, given we're already 4 or 5 into our journey as FINOS. But again, it is perfectly possible. You thought about open source in government 15 years ago, it was a hard sell. So, but to understand why, and hopefully agree on the fact that open source, that financial service is ready for open source, there are really 3 sort of aspects to consider. First of all, the technology landscape is changing drastically in financial services. I mean, even if you don't work in the industry, you probably have heard about fintech. You probably have heard about decentralized technologies like blockchain. You probably heard that, users, like end users, are getting more and more sort of requiring in terms of the user experience that they expect from this type of companies. Very much like we're all used to do everything from a phone. If you think about your experience in travel or experience in hotels, more and more, the several fintech companies are trying to bring that sort of native user experience to financial services. And so the landscape is changing a lot. And one way to look at it is it's not anymore this monolithic, siloed, independent stacks that hardly talk to each other, but we're moving more and more to a common API layer. Again, we're not there yet, but if you think about regulations like GDPR or PSD2, they're more and more trying to standardize the layer of access to this data in a way that it will be brought back into the hands of the consumers. And so this is forcing more and more institutions to really look at, am I selling a tech product, or am I selling a platform in which I'm building connections between value producers and value consumers on top of it? And so if you consider the new landscape, it's easier to think that potentially an open source platform whereby the value is not in the code, but it's in the network, and it's in the value that is exchanged on top of the platform, make more and more sense. Definitely the perception is changing. I mean, 5 years ago when I started and I was going around and pitching open source to banks, those guys thought I was an Italian open source hippie. I mean, there's no hiding that. I mean, I had dreadlocks when I was a kid, so probably they found the picture on Google. But definitely in a few years, and this guy, if you don't know him, Chris Skinner, is a pretty influential influencer in fintech. But you're hearing more and more talk around whether they truly fully understand the strategic benefit of open source. And so they are sort of in the top right corner of an ideal maturity curve. Or at least they grasp the potential for cost savings, for talent acquisition and retention, for actually even making money on open source. Last year's GitHub and Red Hat acquisitions clearly sort of pointed their attention to the fact that, again, open source doesn't necessarily always mean free or that you can make money on it. And so the technology is changing, the perception is changing. But what I want to focus on today is really on which problem are we trying to solve for whom, like why the drivers are aligning for the key players in the industry to be looking at open source more and more seriously. And when I think about who's involved, well, of course, financial institutions. We will spend some time on talking why they are looking at open source. But I think regulators, it's really another very important player that has to buy into this idea of open source regulation or implementing open source regulations in an open source way. Commercial companies, open source companies. There's, I think personally, I mean, I'm running an open source foundation, so I cannot get into commercial venture, and I'm not giving commercial advice here, but certainly it's a pretty greenfield market when it comes to commercial open source company disrupting existing incumbents in the industry. It's a highly locked in industry. And then finally, and most importantly, I always go back to individuals. Whether you are a developer in the industry and you want to start developing in a sort of more modern way, more open way, and solving problems across the firewall. Whether you are a open source developer that is looking for a pretty potentially highly paid next new job, or whether you are an end user of the financial services complex, I believe by having these firms work more transparently, not only we get that user experience that we were saying before improved, but also hopefully we, again, I don't want to overshoot here, but we try to avoid things like in 2008 and 2009. There should be more transparency in the industry. I think we all agree with that. So let's get started. From individuals. I kind of went ahead of myself, but I think, again, when I started in 2015 and sort of the talk of the day was open APIs, I was like, wait, open APIs? Isn't like Web 2.0 like a 2005 thing? It clearly came to me that there is amazing talent in the industry, but oftentimes talent that cannot leverage new technologies, either because they cannot consume open source, but definitely because even when they can consume it, they have to maintain it internally, they cannot contribute back, and so that clearly sort of breaks the pattern and the cycle of innovation. So I feel that there is a big sort of liberatory aspect in what we're doing as a foundation, trying to build an open source community of the likes that we have seen in other industries. Open source developers, we talked about it. I hope by the end of this talk, my main goal for being here today is not to have new member companies, is really to appeal to individual developers who can help us grow and accelerate what we do in the community. There is a huge demand for talent, and on one hand, we've opened these banks to look at open source as a great talent pool. I hope you guys are going to join in and help us out there. There's an interesting aspect that I'm realizing more and more, which is also, it's not really just the developers in financial services firms. One thing that you might be not familiar with is that there is a high churn in this industry, even at executive level. My board members change once a year for the same firm. They typically move from company to company, and there's a good chance that in the next company they're still going to be working with us. But most of these execs end up moving to the next company and having to clean pretty much the same mess that they had cleaned before, not being able at all to reuse what they've done in their previous endeavors. And so, I think both from a career standpoint, there's an opportunity for, again, architects, technology decision makers, to be able to build on previous achievements, and honestly, to do a bit more of an interesting job, rather than always sort of solving the same problems that they've done in their previous firm. And then finally, we talked about us as users of the financial services complex. It is my belief, and we're probably 5 to 10 years away there, but like the constant struggle between regulators and financial services companies on sort of where you tune that level of regulation, I think if we were able to make sort of a third solution, that is to make regulation much more efficient by the means of open source, and hopefully that way, we don't need so much oversight because everything is, or mostly is, transparent, and hopefully as sort of users of the financial services complex, we can benefit from that transparency. So that's where individuals, I think, can benefit from open source in financial services. But how about financial institutions? I mean, it's important to understand that the landscape has changed over the last 10 years. Definitely the top line is not where it used to be. I mean, I'm not claiming that my members are not making money, but if you think, if you compare, for example, the growth of one of those financial service institutions versus, the growth of AWS or any of the tech companies, I mean, they're probably one order of magnitude smaller. I think last year was the first time that the last 2 years, sorry, was the first time that some of the financial services sector restarted growing, and we're still talking about 10% growth year on year, which is nothing compared to your 100% year on year that you see from a tech company. And righteously you would say, but the cost of regulatory has become much more increased after 2009. Just as an example, the cost of MiFID II, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a European-wide regulation that was introduced, I think, a couple of years ago. It is estimated that the overall cost of implementation was around 2.1 billion. I mean, it's a huge amount of money that these companies have to spend without really any effect on the top line. It's just a bottom line item. So the top line is not growing as it did. The bottom line is growing pretty substantially. They are looking at, very different ways of innovating. Like throwing money at the problem, as it used to be, it's not enough anymore. Just to tell you how the perception is changing, this is an article from 2013. Talks about slang. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's a language that was developed inside Goldman Sachs. Actually came through an acquisition in late 90s. And it's been widely regarded as a big differentiator for Goldman Sachs. On top of it, they build their SecDB piece of infrastructure, which is a database of securities, exactly sort of what it sounds like. And look, it's been widely recognized as a big differentiator for Goldman with respect to several other firms, up to 2013. This is an article talking about the same exact thing 4 years later. basically saying, yes, Slang is great, SecDB is great, but it's a proprietary language. You only can know that if you work for Goldman or if you're trained for Goldman. So is it a secret sauce or is it actually a weakness? Because other firms have been able to start on Python, which sort of wasn't really as developed when they started working on it. And so they quickly can leverage things like TensorFlow, like Pandas, which is a data analytics library, if you guys are not familiar with it. And so you're seeing like open source actually helping other firms to catch up in a way in terms of the technology. So what was seen as a big differentiator is potentially becoming a liability. Like building everything in-house is now widely recognized as a potential liability for some of these firms. And so that's, I think, a clear example of this industry trying to look for new ways of innovating. And open source is a really good answer for that. Now, obviously, there is a hate and love relationship with the Silicon Valley. Everyone wants to be a technology company. If you guys are not familiar with the guy on the left, I'm sure you know the guy on the right. But is Jamie Dimon, is the CEO of JP Morgan. So there certainly is a hate and love relationship. On one hand, there is this wanting to be technology companies. On the other hand, there is sort of a constant complaint that big tech is stealing their cake because they're not a regulated business, and so it's much easier for them to, launch a credit card or really eating away at their business. But again, on the other hand, in terms of love, they are stealing a lot of resources from the Silicon Valley. Goldman just hired an exec from AWS, Credit Suisse, an exec from Verizon. So there is this hate, but mostly love relationship. Just as an anecdote, I live in San Francisco, and I've asked my board several times. I'm like, do you guys, should I move to New York? I mean, you guys are all in New York. You guys are in London. Probably I should be there. And they told me, no, you should stay in the Silicon Valley. I was like, because you bring innovation. I'm like, well, OK, thank you. I love living in California, very similar to Italy. But it's not that innovation is a virus. It's not that I'm going to catch it out west and then bring it east. But just to tell you again that there is this at least at the executive level, a big tension for drastically changing the way they operate and they do technology. One thing I gotta say, and as you can see, I'm embodying it, but one thing I gotta say that New York has caught up with the Silicon Valley is certainly the dress code. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Midtown Uniform Instagram account, but if you go around Midtown, you'll see a bunch of people with a button-down shirt and a vest. Now, 2 years, don't tell my parents that I'm wearing a vest, because otherwise they don't let me in Italy anymore. But it's pretty funny to see how even the dress code, in a way, these people that have been usually sort of, that's sort of their attempt to be innovative. And I'm not really making fun of it other than the fact that it's not really a diverse community there in Midtown, and this Instagram account makes a lot of fun of that. But again, you see there's many ways in which the Silicon Alley is trying to get more and more similar to the Silicon Valley. Now, jokes aside, open source in financial services is not a new thing. It's not saying that these companies are not doing open source. It's inaccurate. One of our platinum members, GitHub, was so kind to pull up this data for us. These are actually commits, repositories and committers with email addresses associated with our members, with those banks that you see out there. And this is not just in FINOS. I mean, I wish I had 45,000 repositories under FINOS. But again, just to tell you that whether they know it or not, that's a different question, and we'll talk about it. But like financial services is already doing open source. They're doing several amount of commits. They have a lot of repositories they maintain out there and active committers. Now, when you put it in the context of how many developers these firms have, my board member at JP Morgan has, I think, 16,000 developers working for him. It might not be such a huge number if you normalize it with respect to the potential that these firms have to do open source. But again, they're doing it. And I mentioned before whether they know it or not. I kind of slaughtered here the curve of software adoption to my purpose, but there's really still a pretty broad spectrum in terms of firms in financial services. What's their relationship with open source? I mean, we do have a few firms that are doing strategic contributions. The Symphony example before is a pretty strategic one. You are open sourcing a piece of software to commoditize a competitor or a vendor in which you're strongly locked into. Well, that's pretty strategic. But most of the firms are really between ad hoc contribution or at least a properly controlled consumption. Several of them still doing largely manual consumption of open source. But I think the most interesting one are the ones that tell me, no, we don't do open source. I'm like, really? Like, that's probably the worst possible state where you're thinking that you're not doing open source. But the truth is, developers find a way to do open source. I mean, either 30% of your stack is already built on open source technologies, or if they want to contribute back, they're going to find a way to do it. So I think it urges these companies to find a way to actually provide a path to open source for their thousands and thousands of developers. Shameless plug here, if you're interested in knowing more, we're publishing an actual analyst report later in the year. Really, we interviewed several companies. We have data from GitHub. Hopefully, this is going to serve as a baseline for us to track and measure growth over the next years. Now, last but not least, well, actually, we have 2 more to go. Number 3 is the regulators. I don't know how much you know about regulators in financial services. And again, I'm also still learning after only a few years in this industry. It's a very varied landscape. But they are suffering of several of the same problems in terms of talent acquisition that the financial services companies are seeing. I mean, let's be clear. Cool developers typically want to work for tech companies. They typically want to work for companies that have a high growth, pre-IPO, and they're going to get their stocks, and so on and so forth. And so financial services companies are having issues recruiting the best talent. If you, on top, you tell them, hey, and you're a great open source coder, and you got to come to my firm, and you're not going to be able to do open source anymore and continue fostering your own profile, well, you can easily see why people would choose something different. Regulators are in an even tougher spot because at least a JP Morgan or a Goldman Sachs can throw buckets of money at you. A regulator can't. They don't have the, not only they don't have the appeal, but they also don't have the financial capacity of hiring top talent. And so what you end up with is regulators that oftentimes write regulations that are not up to par with technology. We're working, and I will touch on it later, but we're working on a cloud certification effort for all these banks to mutualize the way they implement controls for going in cloud. And not only that technical value there, but there's also policy and legal value, like in terms of interpreting these policies. Because oftentimes these policies come from the regulator with very little connection to the actual technology that you're trying to impose those regulations on. And so I think this is probably the most important, compelling item for regulators. In the end, what they do is mandating how a certain software should work, and also who has access to configure, deploy, touch change. So really, if we had open source software implementing a certain regulation and a fully automated CI/CD pipeline to deploy that piece of software, there really wouldn't be the need for regulators to go and check every single company, not only what their software does, but also how it's deployed and who has access to it. Obviously, this is a grand vision. It's a long-term vision. I don't want to oversimplify this. But we're certainly seeing more and more examples of how regulators can play a key role. I mean, they're not going to ever endorse any single organization. That's what regulators do. But if you're able to sell them in the idea that they should recommend open source, like the Queen in Holland in 2007, I think that would be a huge advantage for them. I talked about cloud certification. That's one of the areas where we're seeing real traction in the community. KYC is another area. I don't know guys if you're familiar with it, but know your client and anti-money laundering regulations are pretty important and fundamental to every person interacting with the financial services system. And that's basically when you have to fill always the same information when you go to 20 different banks and it's exactly the same, or if you're younger, with the crypto exchanges and all the crypto trading platforms, same thing. Well, every firm spends about 50 million a year on KYC. And largely what they do is exactly the same thing, collecting the same information, validating it against the same credit organizations or Social Security Administration, exactly the same. And there's literally no advantage to the top line. It doesn't make money. It only costs money. So you'll hear from us a little further in a month from now. We have a big conference, which I'm going to shamelessly plug later on in the deck. But hopefully, we'll have a big announcement in this area moving forward. Now, last but not least, open source companies. I mean, you guys are all familiar. If you're here, you probably have been through the last 15, 20 years in which open source has literally taken over industry by industry. And one of the common traits, I mean, I've been working for this company called Alfresco for 7 years, and our pitch for the first years was like, hey, we are like this other company, but we are open source. I mean, I believe that probably we are a little past that stage in which open source is your sales differentiator. But the common trait of these industries that were disrupted by open source was that they were highly locked in. There were players which were highly monopolizing a certain use case or business case, and open source could be seen as just, I can give you the same functionality for a fraction of the cost, and by the way, you can switch at any time. Financial services is by far the most locked-in industry that I've seen in my career. There are certain areas of the financial services workflow which are fully controlled by only one company has sort of the regulatory, has the features and the regulatory connections, the politics, if you want, to fulfill that part of the workflow. And so I think that's where the biggest opportunity lies for people that have experience in building a commercial business model around open source. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not that there are no open source or open fintech companies. OpenFin is one of our members. They build an Electron-based container for traders to build their applications. Quantopian and QuantConnect are SaaS platforms that allow you, they have at least a common open source backtesting engine where you can test your algos and your investment strategies. H2O is an artificial intelligence company which does a lot of open source. But there's not really a lot of fintech companies that have successfully used the open source business model. Now, I'm using here something created by Joseph Jacks. If you know him, is the founder of opensource.capital, is a former technologist, now investor in COS, commercial open source companies. He created just a simple index of commercial open source companies who meet certain criteria, including having reached $100 million. And there's literally 0 commercial open source companies from fintech that have reached that mark. So not only we have a highly locked in environment, but we also don't have a lot of competition out there. So I told about the benefit for individuals. I hope that also if you are representing a services company or a tech company or a fintech company, you'll consider the opportunity of becoming the de facto standard through open source and then use that as your springboard for your business. Finally, and that's where we help, I cannot use the word blockchain in my word. Simple as that. So that's the B word. It's because obviously there is, again, hate and love relationship. On one hand, certainly they're looking into blockchain. On the other hand, there's this fear that blockchain will run the whole financial services set of institutions out of business in 10 years. But again, I think that's where there is another opportunity. Our foundation really is about bringing together 2 generations, 2 different approaches to building technology. We do have a decentralized ecosystem program, but it's very nascent. It's really a placeholder, if you want, for contributions. So that's certainly another area with, obviously, we've seen fintech companies sort of springing right and left over the last 10 years, or maybe more like 3-4 years. But that's certainly another area where we think there is a huge potential for commercial open source. Now, I'm going to wrap and hopefully open up for questions if there are any. That's where we as a foundation come in, and that's where the shameless plug comes in. What do we do as a foundation? Well, this is our programs. I'm happy to go in detail, but programs are nothing more than collections of open source projects or open standards working groups. It's really thematic containers around certain specific areas of financial services. Now, one thing that I want to say is this is our Financial Delivery Accelerator program. You've seen the curve of maturity that I showed before. I don't want to paint a happy picture here. There's certainly a lot of firms who are still in the early days of their maturity in open source. And so that's why we call these our foundational programs. We help not only with education firms to get to the point that not only they can consume, but they can also contribute to open source firm-wide. But most importantly, we pair up firms with each other. Like, it's much more powerful for the compliance guy at JP Morgan to hear it from the compliance guy at Goldman Sachs rather than me telling them how they should be doing open source. That's something that they extremely value. So I want to say, if you're working for a financial institution and you're not yet at the point you're like, wow, this is impossible, I'm never going to be able to get my boss to contribute this, well, that's where we can help in terms of education. If you're ready, great. Jump in any of these programs. It's open. You don't need to pay. This is an open source foundation. Of course, we'd love you as members, as paying members, but entry is open for everyone. But if you're not there yet, come and talk to us anyway. We can help your firm and pair up the legal people with the legal people, the executives with the executives. We can help being your advocates within the firm for open source. One way that we do that is by also providing the CI/CD pipeline for our community. We soon realized that one of our differentiators should be, hey, sure, you can do open source out there, but if you consume open source from FINOS, you'll know that it's IP clean, that is secure, that is compliant, and so we have put in place white source for security validation. We have our own CLA bot to manage contributor license agreements. We obviously deploy out there to Maven, NPM, NuGet, and all the different sort of namespaces under the FINOS namespace. And so really, on one hand, this is the CI/CD pipeline for our community. On the other hand, hopefully, it can become a reference architecture for how firms internally contribute and consume to open source. I mean, some firms, as I said, they have this infrastructure. Some others, this is a really good learning experience for them as they move into the digital transformation. And so wrapping up, I'm strangely on time. This is the call to action. I mean, if you are an individual, if this convinced you that open source is possible in financial services, please come talk to us. We are at booth 82. Again, this is an open source community. There is no price tag attached to it. I'm not selling you anything. Of course, if you are a company instead, we certainly can help you both as a contributor, as a participant, or as a member. We obviously have the capacity of doing a little more for you and be proactive and come and pair up our lawyer with your internal compliance people and get people through the hump. It's a complex problem of aligning culture, legal, technology, and the business understanding of why they should be doing open source.